So this chapter, we're going to look at the protostomes, which are the bilaterians, and on that image there is a picture of an arthropod, and arthropods close out the chapter. Here it's a dragonfly, and so we'll see those in the last section as phylum Arthropoda. So looking at section 1, is an overview of the clades of the protostomes, and so your learning outcome is to list the major clades of the protostomes and identify their distinguishing characteristics. So all the protostomes, so we were out over here to the left looking at sponges and ctenophores and cnidarians, which are radially symmetrical. And now we're over here with the bilateria. Out here those are protostomes, and then out here in this block here we have the deuterostomes, which will be the next chapter. So here we got the protostomes, and you can see that in this edition of the book they broke them up into two clades, the Lophotrochozoa and the Ecdysozoa. In the earlier book they actually had the Lophotrochozoa identified as Spiralia. And then they had this group here, which included the flatworms. You can see the common ancestor down here. And they refer to those as the Platyzoa, which literally translates to flat animals. And then this group out here with this common ancestor would have been a subclade, which was the actual Lophotrochozoa. So there was a significant change in the classification scheme that the author is using in the 12th edition and what they used in the prior edition, so that's something to be aware of. So looking at the Lophotrochozoa now, which in the prior edition included both, which was part of the broader Spiralia, and then there was the Platyzoa, but they're all protostomes, so they're going to have spiral cleavage. This is something we covered in the prior chapter, and most are going to live in the water, and some are going to use cilia or contractions of body musculature to move around for their locomotion. Now, this is where this group gets its name, because not all members, this is more true of the Lophotrochozoa, that group earlier. So that would be right here, this group here. So not all of them, but within this group here, which again was formerly called the Spiralia, the group gets its overall name because of characteristics that we see either in the larval stage or in the mature stage. Some of them are going to have what's called trochophore larva, and the larva is free swimming. It looks like this. They're going to have this ring of cilia around the larval stage, and then it goes through a metamorphosis in terms of the adult form, but this trochophore is characteristic of it, and so you can see the gut here, there's a mouth here, and there's the green outlined area, there's the anus there at the end, so complete gut. In others, they're going to have this characteristic lophophore, which is a horseshoe-shaped crown that has tentacles that are ciliated. So you can see that over here. This is what we would call a Bryozoan, a mature one, which, like the Brachiopoda was the moss plants. This one literally translates to moss animals, bryo for moss and then zoa for animal. They are animals though, and you can see this horseshoe-shaped structure with tentacles, and then there's cilia on there, and then their mouth is in there. So those tentacles and cilia help to bring food towards the mouth for feeding. They filter feed. So there's an image of them larger there. Looking at the other group, which was the Ecdysozoa. And the Ecdysozoa is this other group of protostomes out here. And this group gets its name because the evidence seems to suggest that all of these guys, these groups, these phyla that we see listed here, share this common characteristic in that they shed. Ecdysis means to molt or to shed. So they're going to shed their outer cuticle in order for them to be able to grow larger. So here you can see damselfly, which is related to dragonflies, going through a final molt before turning from a larval aquatic stage to flying adult. The Ecdysozoans, There's two major groups we're going to be looking at here that molt here and that are covered by this chapter. We're not going to look much at some of the other groups that are listed in there. The arthropods, which include these insects, and then the nematodes, which are called roundworms. The first phylum we're going to look at in this chapter is called the phylum Platyhelminthes, and helminth means worm, and platy means flat. So this literally translates to flatworms. And so on the cladogram that we see here, it is a protostome, this phylum. They're Bryozoans, and in the prior book, they referred to this group in this subclade here with that common ancestor as the Bryozoa, which means flat animals. So we'll be looking at those. And, the learning outcomes for this one are to list the distinguishing factors of these flatworms, which they are bilaterians, bilateral symmetry, which means they're triploblastic, based on the last chapter that we covered. And then looking at parasitic tapeworms, explain why the scolex of the tapeworm is not a head. And in order to do that, it's just going to be good to familiarize yourself with the overall morphology of a tapeworm. There's also other parasitic worms called flukes, which you'll have to know. So this is just a short list of goals for your outcomes for this section here. So make sure you do cover the practice questions that I have, or study questions on flukes, which are also parasites. And then there's the free-living flatworms. So looking at the phylum Platyhelminthes, their bodies are relatively simple. These guys, they are acoelomates. So they don't have a body cavity. They're triploblastic, so they lost their body cavity over evolution because their ancestors, all the ancestors of bilaterians, with the exception of the acyl flatworms, had a coelom. So they're not going to have a circulatory system. They don't even have a body cavity, no respiratory system, but they do have complex reproductive system. And these guys, the Platyhelminthes includes marine, saltwater, and freshwater planarians, and then our parasites, which include the flukes and the tapeworms. And so, continuing with some of the basics of the flatworms, they may have cilia and muscle as well to help them move. So their outer epidermis would be covered with cilia, and then they do have musculature that allows their body to move around. I have some video that will be playing while we watch, and you can see some of the way they move around. Overall, they're soft-bodied. They don't have a hard skeleton of any sort. So their bodies are solid, so there's no body cavity. And they're only going to have one opening. They're not going to have a mouth and an anus. They're just going to have an opening, a mouth, and a muscular pharynx. And so any waste needs to come out the same way. So that's referred to as an incomplete gut. So they say incomplete digestive cavity. You can also say gut for that. Many of these species are going to be parasitic, but many are also free-living. And free-living ones live in marine, freshwater, and even moist terrestrial habitats. This is a freshwater, commonly called planarian or planaria. And the genus, at least, used to be Dugesia. And that's going to be seen in the laboratory, specifically that genus of this one here. You can see this is the head end out here. You can see some eye spots. They have very simple eye spots in there. And you can see the branching outline of their digestive gut system. They don't have a circulatory system, but when they take in food, it digests, and that gut is highly branched. That can help distribute food to the tissues of their body. Again, they only have one opening for the digestive cavity. They have muscular contractions of the pharynx, and you'll see that pharynx working on the video I include. So you download it, you can play it yourself as well. It's set up to immediately connect to YouTube and have that video clip play of them. So that food is brought in and then broken down into small bits within that primitive gut. Again, they lack a circulatory system. So how do they get oxygen in their tissues? The tissues are going to diffuse from both the outside and within their gut into those tissues, so they can take in oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. Their gut actually functions to help distribute nutrients to all parts of their body. And again, within the gut, the food is digested extracellularly into smaller bits, and then those small bits are taken in by that cellular process called phagocytosis. Tapeworms, which live in the intestines of other animals, are already living in digested food, so they don't have a gut. They don't have a digestive system. They just simply absorb it through the walls of their body. And that's a matter of these things have such a specialized living requirement, living in the gut, that environment requires them not to produce to spend any energy building organs they don't need. So they don't need the digestive system. But that's not true of free-living ones. So here's a picture of that planarian again. You can see from the top view, these are called eye spots, or sometimes ocelli, which are simple eyes. They can't really form good images, but they can see shadows and so on. These are called auricles, which literally translates to an external ear, but they're not really ears. And on here, they're going to have receptors that are capable of sensing chemicals in the area. It's like smell or taste. And they're going to even have a brain in there, two-sided collection of mass of nerve cells, which is just a simple brain or ganglion, they call it. And then if we took a cross-section, you can see through the body here, see how it's a solid mass here of tissues that are derived from ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. And you can see the muscles here in red. They have longitudinal, and then they have circular muscles that allows for movement. The gut, of course, has the cavity of the gut is not the same as the body cavity. And you can see that this thing has both testes and ovaries, or at least an oviduct here. And so they're hermaphrodites, these planaria are. And then they're going to have two concentrated areas of nerve cells in the head region. That's cephalization, and that's considered their brain. And then they're going to have two nerve cords run to the back. And so if this is a section through there, you can see the two parts of the nerve cord, and then they connect in a ladder-like network there. And then so here are some of the organ systems you can see here. You can see the digestive system. They label the intestine there. It's really overall just a highly branched gastrovascular cavity, really, with one opening. And it's in brown. What they didn't label here, which was in yellow, and that's their excretory system. Excretory system is to get rid of metabolic wastes, like ammonia. And then here's their nervous system, and there's the ganglia there in the head region where they have the eye spots and the sensors. And then you can see two nerve cords running along their body and then connected at more ganglia. And so these are called ganglia, or ganglion singular. And a ganglion is just a collection of nerve cells. And a nerve cell roughly is a nerve cell body with real long extensions called axons. All right, and so a bundle of axons, if you have a bunch of axons, many axons make a what we call a nerve in animal biology. And then you can see the reproductive system here. In pink, you got your ovaries. In blue, you got your testes, and then the ductwork that allows the gametes to move to an area. Now, they make both eggs and sperm, but it's best for them to try to find a mate so they can exchange sperm with each other and cross-fertilize. Here's the excretory system. I found an image to help with the explanation of that. So you can see this highly branched network, and that was similar to what I pointed to that was in yellow here, your excretory system there. And so you can see it's this network of tube-like structures, and on the ends of those tubes are going to be these special structures called flame cells. And the flame cells themselves have a nucleus, and then they have these cilia, flagella-like structures. And so what happens is you have this highly branched network of structures just like this. And so what those do is pick up waste products produced by the tissues. It might be ammonia or other waste products, and pick those up. As you can see here in the image, the arrows showing the input of this material coming in from the interstitial fluids. Interstitial is the tissue fluids. And so these waste products like ammonia end up getting into this tube-like network produced by these tube cells. And eventually that tube network is going to have several openings on the that lead to the outside of the body. and they're called excretory pores. So that way they're able to get rid of this. There's that metabolic waste you see there. So some of those terms I mentioned are here, including the flame cells, which have that cilia-like structures to help move the fluids that are within there. And this is very important. Animals need to get rid of waste products when they have so many tissues producing waste. We got to get rid of it, otherwise it becomes toxic. So some of these tubes lead to the outside, and some will lead to the gut. So, and in the gut, they can just send it out the mouth. Then you have your nervous system. It's a simple nervous system. Again, anterior means towards the front, posterior towards the back, and so Annelids is a root in there before it, ahead of. And then here you have, there's your ganglia there, like I mentioned, your two nerve cords. You're going to have eye spots, and then you also have some chemoreceptors up here that can smell and taste the area there. And then for reproduction, as you mentioned, they have both male and female. That makes them hermaphrodites. And so they do undergo sexual reproduction, and some of them do have the capacity to asexually regenerate. There's this classic thing you do with planaria, those free-living ones, where you can cut them right down the middle, and each side actually ends up making a whole other animal. So that's a kind of weird, odd ability that at least some flatworms have. Not to say all of them do. So there's going to be some major groups of flatworms. You're going to be able to see a planaria actually moving in its environment and even feeding there. And so as you watch the video there, I'm going to explain. It's a free-living flatworm, and you can see it's sensing around its environment. It's going to actually extend its pharynx in that video. When you if you download this and you open it up and then you run it, it'll go straight to those videos, and then you can always go straight to YouTube to check it out if you want. There's the pharynx coming out, the belly side of the animal. The belly is called the ventral side, and so that planaria belongs to a group. So this is the phylum Platyhelminthes. So it's kingdom, phylum, and then class. So traditionally they were placed in the class called Turbellaria. So this would be the class Turbellaria. Now it's not thought that this group is monophyletic, so they're trying to figure out what the relationships are there. And I mentioned Dugesia as a genus. It's italicized for that reason. And it's commonly studied in biology labs, living ones, as well as ones that are preserved on the slide. And then there's another group, the class Neodermata, which means new skinned animals, sort of. And some of the more traditional schemes just actually had these as separate. So it was a class Nematoda. They're still called trematodes, and these are the flukes. These are all parasitic. And it seems that they now put them together in this larger group, Neodermata, and then trematodes are a separate branch of that. These are the flukes, so these are all parasitic. And the other group is the tapeworm group. Both are parasites. So all members of the Neodermata are parasites. So the flukes which we'll look at right now, the flukes are going to be get within a host that they parasitize, and they'll have suckers, anchors, and hooks to help them attach to those organ tissues that they are connected to. Now, trematodes typically are going to have a complex life cycle that involves 2 or more hosts. In some cases, the host is a human overall, and they'll have larval stages within the other hosts, and these stages include mericidium, Sporocystoidia, and Cercaria, and these are described more completely in your lab or laboratory manual. Now, the oriental liver fluke is called Clonorchus sinensis. That's the binomial, that's the full scientific name. And then there's many Schistosoma species. So of the genus Schistosoma, there's many. And Clonorchus, sometimes you'll see it as Opisthochus. The reason I remember that is because I looked up the meaning back when I took a parasitology class. But I think they're both used. I don't know which one is the most currently accepted genus for that fluke. And so this is that Clonorchus, the oriental liver fluke. And one of the reasons it was called Opisthochus is because back here, I'm sort of tracing out, I can kind of see it in this one. is there's the testes, and then up here is where the ovaries and uterus are as well. So they're hermaphrodites. Here's a sucker for the mouth up here. And opus means, you're going to see that root again. Opus, though, means towards the back, or rear, or posterior. And orcus means testes, or testis, which is where sperm are produced. So they're toward the back. This is posterior side, and then anterior, the front end. And so this is the adult worm, and the adult worm resides within the mammalian host. In this case, this one, humans are one of those mammals that can be a host to this parasite. And because it's an adult form and sexually matured, then humans are referred to. This is an important term to learn. It's not directly in the notes. It's going to be brought up in your lab manual. It's called the definitive host. The definitive host is the one where the sexually mature parasite is in. So we would be the definitive host along with some other mammals. All these other hosts that include the snail in this life cycle and this fish, which is in the minnow family, those are intermediate hosts. They're intermediate hosts because they are not host to the adult form. So here are the different ones. So this parasite will produce a lot of eggs. The eggs get spread. The females produce a tremendous amount of eggs because they all never end up most of them never end up getting into a host. So at least make a lot, and at least some will survive to make the next generation. So here the egg is released, and it'll have within their larva called Myristidium, or Myristidia plural. And then those enter the snail, which is an intermediate host, and within there, the couple of stages are going to go on. So the first, the Myristidium goes and becomes a sporocyst, and then the sporocyst is going to have many cells in there, and each one becomes a rhydia. And the rhydia is going to reside within the snail still, and then the rhydia produces many cercaria, which look like a tadpole, and they're very, very tiny. And those get free from the snail, and then swim to the fish, and then burrow into the tissues of the fish. So within the flesh of this fish now, you're going to have these cysts that have the metacercarial cysts that they call them. And so the metacercaria are a stage that if a human or other mammal host eats the flesh of this animal without cooking it properly, then you get the infection. And then it metamorphosizes into the adult. So this is common of all flukes. And this fluke here, Clinorchus, belongs to that group of flatworms called the trematodes. And the formal name is Nematoda, the formal taxon name, but they're informally called trematodes. Here's another trematode that has a complex life cycle, and your book didn't have it, but it describes this life cycle in the reading as you read through it. So I went to the Center for Disease Control website, and here they describe 3 species of Schistosoma as the genus. So this is the genus, and then there's different ones here, as you can see. And this one has separate male and female. And as adults, the female is larger, and you can see the suckers there on the ends there. And the male finds the female and completely stays with the female within a groove she has, the female has within there. And all the female is doing is producing a bunch of eggs, and the male is just fertilizing the eggs this whole time. Whenever you see SPP, that means plural species, means more than one species. If you just say SP, that's a species of, right? So you're going to have all those same stages that we saw earlier. The thing about the schistosoma is they're called blood flukes. The other one was a liver fluke. These blood flukes are going to reside in blood vessels, and depending on the species, and there's 3 different ones they have here: Schistosoma mansoni, Schistosoma japonicum, and hematobium, I believe, and they show what locations they occur within here. So A is small intestine, B is the colon or large intestine, and then C looks like the rectum there. When the eggs are produced by the adult, and in here the human or other closely related mammal is the host, is a definitive host, A lot of eggs are produced, and when they're released, they have to break through the blood vessels and then get into the digestive tract so they can be eliminated with the feces of the definitive host. And they're released as these eggs, right? And so that's that same egg stage there. The Nemertea is released. It has cilia. And then it gets into one of these snail hosts, where then it goes through a sporocyst, ultimately going to produce those tadpole-like cercariae that then can enter the human. And here's the thing, there's no fish host here. So here, if the human is wading around in the water, instead of the cercaria burrowing into a fish, they burrow directly into the skin of the human host. So in water that has a lot of this parasite here, and a lot of times this is in areas where people grow crops within water, and then there's poor sanitation overall, where the human feces or animals that are a host to this, the feces ends up getting into that water, and there go all the eggs within there, the eggs that are carrying the larva. So it is a serious disease because it can cause lots of bleeding, anemia, and even death overall, with all kinds of inflammation that occurs there. 200 million people in tropical Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East are afflicted by this. 200,000 die every year, so it is a serious disease. And the diseases are of this types of parasites are called schistosomiasis. And then it talks about the pathology there, about breaking through the wall. Pathos is the disease part of it. Then we have the tapeworms, and here they went ahead and gave a broader group called the Cercomeromorpha. And the Cercomeromorpha include the tapeworms and another group of related flatworms that aren't intestinal parasites. But if we look at just the tapeworms themselves, they belong to a group called the Cestoda. And these are the ones that already live in digested food, so they don't have a gut like the other flatworms do. All these guys this group is, they're going to have this head that has these hooks and suckers. And this is a picture of the head here. It's not really a head in a sense that we have brain and eyes and anything. This is just the anterior end of it. The other end is the end that's producing lots and lots of eggs and segments. So we call this anterior end the scullex. It's not really a true head or cephalization as we see in other bilateral symmetrical animals. So they're going to hang on to the inner wall of the intestine where there's lots of digested food already. And so the basic body of the tapeworm is you have the scullex with the suckers and the hooks, and then you have these segments that continue to grow. And as you move further back, so this is supposed to be the inside wall of the host, could be a human or other animal. And these segments, as you move further back, those segments are called proglottids. And as they move backwards, each segment has both ovaries and testes, and even a uterus where the female that the eggs have been fertilized, where the eggs are going to be produced. And then towards the rear, these proglottids break off and then are eliminated with the feces of the host overall. So these are hermaphroditic, and the proglottids are formed continuously. There is a tapeworm that humans can get from undercooked beef. It's called Taenia saginata. There's another one. It's the pork tapeworm called Taenia saglanum, I think. It's the same genus. You should know that genus, Taenia, since it does affect humans. So you'll see that as a representative genus to know. I had to know it when I took General Bio Part 2 for my lab exam. But it is one of those human parasites, and again, you can get it from eating undercooked beef. In the phylum Rotifera, which are the Rotifers, these are microscopic animals. You can see the scale down here. This is in micrometers. They're really tiny animals, and you need magnification to see them. So for this section, your learning objective or outcome is to explain why rotifers are referred to as wheeled animals. There's more to it than that, but short answer to that one is that at their mouth area they have this coronal structure, corona, and it's lined with cilia to help it filter and bring food particles in. And when the cilia are moving, it looks like little wheels turning, so that's where they get their name from. They are bilaterally symmetrical. They do not have segments, and they are pseudocoelomates. But some of the evidence suggests, based on their morphology and some other bits of information, that their ancestors were probably acoelomates like the flatworms. So the rotifers are there right within that subclade that the prior edition was calling the Bryozoans. They do have highly developed internal organs. As you can see there, they have a complete gut, digestive tract. They have this little foot or toe-like area here that they can use to attach to a substrate, but they can move location if they want. That corona is why they're called the wheeled animals, because of the cilia I mentioned earlier, because of that cilia, which is used for locomotion and to sweep food. So if they detach from where they're hanging on, they can use the cilia to help them get around, along with a bit of body movement as well. So just to show where they were on that cladogram, they were right there, along with on the same clade as the Platyhelminthes. So we're now looking at mollusks, and we're moving from this clade here, which the prior edition referred to as the Bryozoa, to this clade over here, which was originally in the prior edition the Brachiopods. And so we're going to look at mollusks, which the mollusks are sometimes called soft-bodied animals. Now, they are soft-bodied animals, but some of them do produce a shell, and the shell is hard. Some of them lost the shell. The ancestral form probably had a shell. And so this is the phylum Mollusca. That's the formal taxon. It's at the phylum rank. Kingdom is just above it, Animalia, and we commonly call them the mollusks. Your learning outcomes here are to list the defining features for the phylum Mollusca, what makes them a group. Describe representatives of the 4 best known groups of mollusks. So we're not going to cover all the classes. The class is the next rank below there. And then explain the distinguishing features for cephalopods. That's the group which includes the octopus and squid. So this is the second in diversity only to arthropods. Arthropods are extremely diverse, meaning the number of species that have been identified. They include snails, slugs, which are snails without a shell, clams, oysters, octopuses, squid. Some have a shell, some do not. Like an octopus does not have a shell, but a clam does. Okay, so you can see here this is a clam-like animal, probably a scallop. And it has 2 shells or 2 halves, so they call these bivalves. Here's an octopus. They call them cephalopods. So you have one with a shell, one without a shell. Here's a primitive relative of an octopus. It's called the nautilus, and it has its tentacled arms there, but it still has its shell, whereas the octopus does not. And then here is a slug, which is shares a close relation with a snail, but it's like a snail without its shell. And so you see some with shell, some without shell. So what are some features of the phylum overall? First of all, they range in size from being very, very tiny, microscopic, to huge. There's a clam that can weigh nearly 600 pounds. That's 270 kilograms. A kilogram is roughly 2.2 pounds. So when you do the math, it's like about 600 pounds. They live in oceans, and most groups have remained there. The snails are a group that's actually left the water. Some live in fresh water as well. Some of them are important food sources for humans, and that's important economically because food's a part of our economy. Some affect our economy in other ways. Oysters, for example, produce pearls, which people use for jewelry. The inside of some of the shells is shiny, just like a pearl. It's called mother of pearl. And that may be used for making certain decorative items. And then some are pests. There's one called a zebra mussel, which is kind of like a clam-like. It's got the 2 shells like a clam or an oyster. But this one's been spread around the world, and it becomes very invasive. It doesn't have any natural enemies in its new habitat, and then it just multiplies like crazy and clogs up drainage pipes and messes up boats and causes all kinds of damage that costs a lot of money to fix. So it damages both our economy and the ecosystem. This is the scientific name for it, but it's commonly called the zebra mussel. That's your giant clam there. You can see the two sides, the two halves of the giant clam. So looking at the overall body plan of mollusks, they are going to have a mantle, which is a thickened epidermis, a sheet of epidermal tissue. The epidermis is the outer covering, and it secretes the shell structure over there. So the mantle itself actually produces a cavity. It's not the body cavity, but it's a chamber that the mantle surrounds. So they can take in, if they live in the water, they'll take in the ocean water within that cavity and then use it to circulate around their gills and so on. It's not part of their body cavity. I use an analogy. If I'm in the lab, I'll take my lab coat and I'll open it up and say, just imagine if I had skin and my skin was stretched out like that, like my open lab coat right in front of them. And then if I close it like that in front of me, there's a space in there. My body cavity is still here with my organs, but there's a cavity made by the mantle itself. So that's what's meant by bounding the mantle cavity. And again, the mantle secretes the shell. The mollusks also are going to have a foot or a modification of the foot. So you see a very primitive representative. These animals still exist. They're called chitons. They belong to a class called Platyhelminthes. And the last part, phora, comes from the root phoris, which means to carry. What are they carrying? They're carrying these 8 plaques here. And the basic body plan for a bilaterally symmetrical animal, whether it's a cat or this chiton, let's just take a basic 4-legged animal in my stick figure here. This is the head end, that would be anterior towards the front, and this would be the tail end, posterior. The back is called dorsal, and the belly side here is the ventral side. Okay. So when we say foot, where's the foot? The foot is on the ventral side here. So they're labeling the foot here as the foot here. They can use that foot for locomotion, and that's part of it. This foot has modified in some over evolution, descent with modification into arms or tentacles, like in the cephalopods. So when you look at the arms of an octopus, that's the foot is just the foot's been evolved into 8 different arms with suckers on them and so on. And another thing you're going to see while I have the picture here is above the foot, if this is ventral, then anything above that is towards the dorsum or the dorsal side. And you can see all of the internal organs here. Okay. And those organs, a lot of them are just compacted together. They have a reduced body cavity. Remember we talked about in an earlier chapter that the coelom evolved first, and then some animals evolved, or their descendants slowly lost that body cavity. They have a very reduced body cavity. They still have one, but a lot of their organs are just packed together, kind of like we saw in flatworms. So they have a very reduced body cavity. And so what do we call that mass of organs? It's not within a cavity. It's a mass, and they call it a visceral mass. And viscera means internal organs. So you can see part of this visceral mass includes digestive system and reproductive organs and digestive organs. Where the heart is back here, and some of the intestine passes through there, they're still part of the true body cavity that still remains. It's reduced in there. So that's what's mentioned here on this page, the internal organs. The coelom, which is the body cavity, is highly reduced. It's going to be limited to small spaces that surround some of the excretory organs, like our excretory would be kidneys, heart, and some of the intestine. So most of the digestive system, excretory, reproductive organs are going to be within that dorsal visceral mass. So we talk about what's the basic body plan of a mollusk. They've got a mantle. That's one. What does the mantle do? It secretes the shell. They have a ventral foot, dorsal visceral mass. That's your body plan right there. Okay, so mantle, ventral foot. So ask, what are the characteristics of mollusks in general? Mantle, ventral foot, dorsal visceral mass. Basic part of the anatomy of any mollusks. Okay? So the mollusks that are aquatic are going to have gills, and those gills are called ctenidia. See, silent. Ctenidia is their gills. And in many cases, if they're filter feeders, like clams don't even look like they have a head. It's like they totally lost cephalization there. They just pass water through their mantle cavity, and their gills secrete a mucousy material that captures food particles. That's called filter feeding. So they filter their food out, and then the cilia, and this is like what we have inside of our windpipe here, our trachea, you call it. It's lined with cilia, and we produce mucus that captures polluted particles that are in the air, and then the cilia sweep it up, and then we just swallow without even knowing it. Well, that's what they do. They sweep those food particles towards their mouth, which would be located on the anterior end. For the clam, here's the ventral foot. Here's your dorsal visceral mass. So this is the ventral side of the clam. They have a left and a right shell. So we're looking, the foot and the mouth is actually right there. So this is the anterior side of the clam. This is posterior, where they have their siphons. And they have an in current that takes in and circulates around the cavity. Here's your gills right there. And then the gills eventually sweep. They have another gills on this side, on the left side. This is the shell is the right side. It's on the other side of the internal organs here. Sweep that food up here to the mouth, and then the water circulates back out the excurrent siphon, which is on top. And the excurrent siphon is separated from the incurrent. And right there is where the anus is. So the anus releases waste right here, and it goes out, being flushed out there. So even though this clam doesn't look like it has a head end to it, it still has the ventral foot, dorsal visceral mass. It's got a shell, which in some have lost the shell. So the basic body plan of the ancestors of all of these is that. So shell for many, but some no, right? Some not with shell. So you can see here, there's that chitin again, and then you have your gastropods. That's the formal class name, Gastropoda, and they have the same thing. Here's your ventral foot. You have dorsal visceral mass. You have a shell. You have a mantle that secretes the shell. There's your clam, which is a bivalve, and then here's a cephalopod, and this is a squid, which is kind of related to like octopus. They're going to have 8 arms, but then they're also going to have two tentacles. So this is their modified foot. So this would be the ventral side. This would be the dorsal side. And the cephalopods here have a really good vision. They're active predators, and they can move swiftly in there. And many of them have either a reduced shell or no shell at all. So the shell itself, if they do have it, it is to protect against predators and tough environments. They secrete it from the mantle, and it may not be essential in many cases, because we see in several groups it's been lost, like in the gastropods, the snails, their cousins, the slugs, which is a snail without a shell, doesn't have it. And then when we look at the cephalopods, that's a different group. They lost their shell. That nautilus that I showed you earlier with all those arms, is what the more primitive ancestry looked like that gave rise to an octopus, which doesn't have a shell. So you see 2 lines of mollusks that lost their shells. The shells typically have 2 layers, and the shell, a main component is a mineral called calcium carbonate. It's the same thing that makes up an eggshell. The internal layer is going to be shiny. They call that mother of pearl, which we mentioned earlier. It's also called nacre. There's another name for it. And when you get something like a clam, if it gets something that irritates, so you can see the shell here, and then you can see that lining, there's the mantle, and then on the other side, here's the other mantle. That mantle produced the shell on the outside. If anything gets between the mantle and the shell, it irritates the mantle, and the animal secretes that shiny material around it, and that forms these shiny pearl-like structures there. So those pearls are produced by something that irritates the animal. And so I got ahead of myself here. These animals also have the basic simple one, like this chitin here, which is a primitive form, are going to have a structure called a radula. And this radula is a characteristic of many mollusks, and some it's modified further or lost altogether, like in clams. They don't have this, but the original body plan is thought to have had it. It's a tongue that has these hardened chitin-like structures, and this is what one looks like under scanning and magnification of an electron microscope. So you can see these little rough structures here are used to scrape things off like algae and so on. And so if we looked at the mouth here of the chitin and you zoomed in, there's the mouth right there. There's the radula. You can see those little spiky-like structures. And what they do is they just extend that radula outward, and they can scrape up algae and other food and then take it into their digestive system. Some types of mollusks have modified this radula to be used for predatory action, like you see with squid and octopi. They have a beak. The radula is turned into a beak. It almost looks like a bird beak, and it's used to bite their prey that they capture. Some gastropods, which are snails and slugs, some of them have modified their radula to drill into clamshells. So they drill in there, and then they eat the inside of the clam. And then there's a video here of a snail called conus or cone snails, and theirs is modified as a harpoon. And this little video segment shows one of those snails harpooning a fish and then inhales that fish. So these are some pretty cool videos there that are online. So you can see it's extending what would be like the mouth in a regular snail, and boom, it just caught that fish with this harpoon, and they produce venom. And so that venom is going to paralyze and probably kill the fish, and then the snail just takes it in, and there's its meat diet. So you can see it taking in the fish, just taking it into the mouth right there. And that's a snail, believe it or not. Pretty cool stuff. And the bivalves, they don't have through evolution, they lost the radula, and then they filter feed with their gills, as I mentioned before. So I do have some cool videos on this PowerPoint if you download. And now for waste removal, they do have to get rid of their waste. All tissues are going to produce nitrogen waste in the form of ammonia. And the name of their specialized organ is not flame cells like we saw in the flatworms. They're called nephridia. And our kidneys have these repeated units, millions of them, called nephrons. So there's a similar terminology there. So these nephridia, they're going to consist of cilia-lined openings called nephrostomes. And there's that root again, stoma. We've been seeing that. We saw that with the stomata under the leaves. That means a mouth. So you have this little structure, has a little opening, and then it leads to this little tube-like structure. And then this is part of the nephridia. Okay? So there's your nephrostome there. And so that opening there is to be able to pick up fluid from the body cavity, which would have this waste product. And then to take that in, and then the cells that line this are going to bring back important things, because if you're going to take some fluid out, it likely has useful things, not just waste products. It's going to have sugars, it's going to have important electrolytes, salts, other things that the animal needs. You don't want to just get rid of all of it. So waste removal also involves balancing your mineral balance, your electrolyte balance. So that overall, that water balance and balancing your minerals is called osmoregulation, like for osmosis overall. So this is about getting rid of waste and your water balance and electrolyte balance. So that's the function of your excretory system. And in the circulatory system, they do have, all the mollusks have an open circulatory system, just like was discussed earlier, where eventually their fluid which is their blood, or hemolymph, we'll call it, actually leaves these relatively small blood vessels and then just moves around within the chamber that's part of their body cavity called the hemocele. And so means cavity, right? And they do have a heart that is the motor for this to pump it around. Now, the cephalopods, which are the octopus and the squid, those have a closed circulatory system, so their blood stays within blood vessels. And so, for mollusk reproduction, they are gonochoric, which means, as mentioned earlier, they have separate male and female. A few are hermaphroditic, and some oysters can actually change sex depending on the conditions, environmental conditions, which includes information they get from others in the population. Now, most engage in external fertilization. That means they release the egg and the sperm externally. Gastropods, especially they live on land, are going to have internal fertilization because there's no water there. The mollusk zygote is going to undergo spiral cleavage. It has to because mollusks are in the protostome clade. And spiral cleavage, we learned in the last chapter, is a characteristic of protostomes. Mollusks do have some larval stages, so for some of the mollusks, the bivalves and the marine snails, they're going to have another additional stage called the veliger larva. Others would just have the trochophore larva. This trochophore, as we saw earlier, remember, has that line of cilia going around here. It has a mouth and then an anus somewhere around here. And eventually this metamorphoses into something else. But if you are a bivalve, which is a clam, oyster, or a marine snail, the larva, the trochophore larva, goes through metamorphosis and forms a veliger, and then starts to form specialized structure of the foot overall, and then it settles somewhere and then metamorphoses into these. Now, these are extremely tiny, so they are going to be pushed around by currents, and that allows them to move much further from when they were located. Clams don't move very much. You might guess, and snails, well, snails don't go fast either. So this is one way you can get the animal to move somewhere else, is allow the larva to move to another location. So there are 7 or 8 recognized classes of mollusks, but we're going to look at 4 quickly here. There is the chitons, and their name is class Polyplacophora. You're going to need to know that for your second lab exam. So you should learn it for the lecture as well. So this is the class. The phylum is Mollusca, kingdom is Animalia, domain is Eukarya. Supergroup Opisthoconta, the animals and the fungi belong to that. It's not a formal taxon. It's the Opisthoconta represents a clade of eukaryotes. Then the gastropoda, just like pseudopodia, poda meant foot. This literally translates to stomach foot, like they have the foot there on their belly side. So this includes snails that have a shell, slugs, and another group of gastropods called limpets. And then bi means 2, and valve refers to the 2 shells. They have a left and a right shell. Those include clams, oysters, and scallops. And then cephalopoda, I always remember this because it looks like they use structures associated with what looks like their head for movement. So literally translates means headed foot-headed or head-footed, something like that. And those include squids, octopus, cuttlefish. Those are cool. And that chambered nautilus, which actually still has a full shell. So here is the Polyplacophora, which means to carry many plates. And they're going to characteristically have these 8 dorsal plates that are overlapping. They don't have a segmented body underneath, even though the plates look like there's segmentation underneath. Not segmentation like you see in earthworms. Now, most chitons are going to be grazing herbivores, and they like to attach to things like rocks and then move around there. And so these plates help protect anything from hitting their soft bodies underneath. And they're going to feed with that radula. Then you have the class Gastropoda, and this includes the snails and the slugs and the limpets. And there's a diagram of what a snail looks like. And then we saw that marine snail, that cone snail, that has a radula modified like to a harpoon. The group is primarily marine, but there are some freshwater and terrestrial. This is the only group to have terrestrial forms. You don't have terrestrial clams or octopus, right? So they do have a single shell, and some, like the slugs, have evolved to have lost the shell. They do have a head with a pair of tentacles, and at the end they have these light-sensitive structures that we can refer to as eyes. You can see the two tentacles right there and right there. And they have what's called torsion, and we don't want to confuse torsion with another concept of coiling. And torsion, this is kind of unique among animals. When they're developing, their mantle cavity and the anus are moved from posterior to the front. So the anus is typically going to be referred to as being in the back, but let's take a look here. When the snail takes in food and we go into the digestive system, which is in green there, okay, you can see then that this now coils back around. There's some other organs within there, perhaps gonads or some other organs. But then you have here, your digestive system is now moving towards the front, and then there's the anus out there towards the front. Now this one has a lung, so it's probably this one is a terrestrial snail. So that's torsion. That the internal mass has been flipped. What normally is toward the back is towards the front. That's different than torsion. So you don't want to confuse, coiling. So torsion was the other one. Okay, so that torsion is where the mantle and the anus kind of are flipped. And then for coiling, that refers to the coiling that we see in the snail here. Now there's a right and a left mantle, just like you see in a clam. And what happens here is the spiraling occurs is because one of the mantles is going to produce the shell faster than the other one, and that creates this spiraling effect here in the snails. So that's different than torsion. And then we have these really cool nudibranchs, and there's going to be a video playing where it shows a nudibranch is going after a sea anemone, which we covered in the last chapter, the Cnidarians. And that's pretty important. So if you watch it real quick, there's your nudibranch. It's a reddish color, and there's a sea anemone, a tube anemone they call it. And they're predators of these sea anemones. And watch it, just went right in there, and it's going to inhale that sea anemone, and there's its meal. You might recall sea anemones have those stinging cells called nematocysts, or we also call them cnidocytes, right? Well, these animals are probably, they're not affected by it, and what they do is they're able to move those stinging cells towards their surface, and then they can use them for their own defense. So not only do they use the animal for food, then they take their weapons from them. So they're called nudibranchs, and they're really brightly colored, a lot of them. And so this is another species different than that other one there. So again, they use those the organelles from those stinging cells as their own defense. Pretty cool. Then you have the bivalves, and I got a video here of quahog mussels that they put in an aquarium with a lot of particulate matter in there that they like to feed on. And so this video shows how they take water in through their in-current siphon, and this whole video, 1 minute, plays out 10 minutes of actual time, so it's time-lapse video. So you can check that out if you download this here. But these bivalves, they have the two shells. Each shell is called a valve. They include clams, scallops, mussels, oysters, and others. Many are marine, some are freshwater. There's no radula. They're filter feeders. There's no distinct head. They don't appear to have a head at all, but they do have a mouth. They have the two shells. The two shells typically would want to stay open with a ligament, but then they have two muscles called adductor muscles. Adductors pull things into the main axis of the body. So they have an anterior and posterior adductor that pulls the shells together. They're going to bring water in through an inhalant or in-current siphon, and then water goes out through the exhalant siphon, which I showed you how that water circulates in the diagram earlier. And here's that same diagram. You do have a mouth up here. The inhalant siphon, this is the right side of the shell because this is anterior, this is posterior, and this is ventral. So you can imagine just an animal laying on its belly with the head end here and the tail end out here, and then just laying down here. So The side on the other side of what we can see is the right side. This would be the left side. So this is the right valve that's still there, shell overall. And so again, they bring in water in here, and then the gills capture with mucus the particles, and then they have cilia, and that cilia brings the food towards the mouth here and then into the digestive system overall. And then any waste products that makes its way out is released, and then out the exhalant siphon. So you got to remember, we cut this animal in half, so we've cut into the organs and everything there. So all of this is actually closed off to make the mantle cavity. And then you have the cephalopoda, and the cephalopoda 700s, they're strictly marine. And they're very active predators. And again, there's the octopus, the squid. So they go and they capture different kinds of prey items, fish, other kinds of things. They do have a closed circulatory system, and their foot is evolved into a series of arms with suction cups, which you can see there with this octopus there. Their radula is modified into a beak-like jaw, and their saliva for many species produces toxic substances. So when they bite, they can get that toxic saliva into the animals to help immobilize them. They do have a relatively large brain in that, and that they should exhibit a sort of intelligence, even problem solving overall. And they have really well developed eyes. The eyes are just amazing bits of evolutionary innovation there. And here you can see that they did an experiment with a young octopus. And the octopus here in this case was going after a crab that it can see. So the crab was in this clear bottle, and this octopus was able to figure out how to open it. So that's problem solving. Pretty amazing stuff. The cephalopods have ability to change color, so I found some video that allows them to show some of that there. But going through this here, many of them lack an external shell at all, except for the chamber nautilus. So that's that really primitive one that has that spiral-looking shell. Squid and cuttlefish still have a shell, but it's internal, and sometimes they call that shell if they remove it a cuttle bone. They all can move by jet propulsion, and what they do is they take water into their mantle cavity, and then they force with a lot of pressure that water out of the excurrent siphon, and it looks like a jet. You can see in the video playing there, this octopus can change color. And the cells that allow that to do that are called chromatophores, and there's that root again, phores, phorees, to carry. To carry what? To carry colored materials. Chromato means color. So they're able to change color and blend in with their surrounding. They can even change the texture of their epidermis, or their surface skin. Is pretty cool. Some of them have an ink gland, and when they're harassed by another predator, they can release that ink, and it goes out along with the water that they are using to get away. And it confuses the predator. Overall, it may even mess with the senses of the animal who's trying to eat them. And you can see in this image from your textbook, this is a relatively large octopus, probably a lactic octopus. And you can see the diver there. I'm outlining him here. That's the body of the diver. There's the diving belt with the weights to help keep them down there. And you can't see his head because he got inked as the octopus is jetting away from the potential predator. In this phylum is commonly called the ribbon worms. The phylum or formal taxon is the Nemertea. And one of the learning things covered in the section outcomes is to describe the ways in which ribbon worms are similar and different from flatworms. So they actually look like flatworms, but there are some major differences. Overall, there are about 2,400 species of cylindrical to flattened, very long worms. That's one of the characteristics. And you can see their position here. They're still within the Lophotropozoa, within that subclade that's right there. So there they are on that location there. So the features for the Nemertea, they are most are marine. A few species live in fresh water, and some live in humid, a lot of moisture in the air, terrestrial habitats. There's one species called Linnaeus longissimus, and it's reported to measure up to 60 meters in length. So this would be the longest animal. known. A meter is just over 3 feet, so that's really long. The body plan does resemble a flatworm, but there is some evidence that does not place it with that other subclade that is of the Platyzoans. And one of them is that these animals have a complete gut. Remember, think back to the free-living flatworms like the planaria. It just had one opening, an incomplete gut. So they're going to have a body cavity filled with fluid. It's the coelomic cavity, or the coelom. They refer to it as the rhynchocyl. And that's another reason the flatworms don't have a body cavity at all. They are gonochoric with sexual reproduction, and that means separate male and female. They are capable of some asexual reproduction by fragmentation. And here you can see one of those Linnaeus longissimus. They belong to the Lophotrochozoa. This is from the older book overall. Remember I said where there was a subclade of the Lophotrochozoa that was identified in the earlier textbook in the 11th edition. And so you had the Lophotrochozoa, which included the mollusks. And then where the flatworms were with the rotifers, those were referred to as a clade called the Platyzoans. So why are these ribbon worms that look like flattened ribbons not Platyzoans? One of these, they have a complete gut. Okay. They have blood vessels. That means they have a body cavity. You don't have a body cavity, you're not going to have blood vessels. So all of these things suggest that they're not, should not be with that group. So now we're going to look at the phylum Annelida and their annelids. These are commonly called the segmented worms. The formal name is phylum Annelida. And so you can see here's a clamworm here. It belongs to the genus Neres, and you can see a lot of little segments all along the body there. So looking at the learning outcomes, number one is to explain how circular and longitudinal muscles. They have muscles that run along their body, and then those that go around the body. And these segmented worms facilitate their movement. Then two, distinguish between Errantia and Sedentaria. This is going to be something that I'll allow you to do if you have some time with your textbook. Other than that, I'm not going to spend much time in some changes in the taxonomy right now, just because it would take an extended amount of explanation as to what's been uncovered with more recent studies. So we're going to stick to a little bit more traditional classification for now, especially in the laboratory, and then we'll make sure that occurs here for the lecture as well. Now, these segments allow for these repeating units along the body. And within any given segment, you may have some specialization occur. So you might not have just one long intestine, but now you'll have different sections of the digestive system. The group is not thought to be monophyletic overall. That means sharing one common ancestor. And a third objective that I must have missed here, I just noticed that, is that to describe the adaptations that leeches have for feeding off the blood of other animals. So they're ectoparasites. So here we are on our diagram here. We're still in this clade that the older book referred to as the actual Lophotrochozoans. And this one over here was the Platyzoans. They're all protostomes to begin with. And so, looking at the features of annelids in general, for their body plan, they do have a well-developed head, so there is cephalization here. They have a cerebral ganglion, which is their brain, and that's really what our brain is. It's just a big collection of a lot of nerve cells. And they're going to have sensory organs in the ring-like segments, and many species do have eyes. The earthworm does not, because it typically lives underground. The segments are going to be divided internally by septa. So these are going to be membranes that actually divide there. So here they cut off away from the wall of the earthworm there. You can see everywhere there's a segment, right there and right there and right there. Within the body, there is a membrane that separates one segment of the body cavity from the next. So that body cavity is going to be filled with fluid. It's not hollow, but there are these membranes that wall off overall. So these Segments are going to have their own sets of repeating organs. They're going to have their own nephridia, which are the excretory organs. They're going to have their own ganglia, which is like little smaller collections of nerve cells. The main ganglion is the brain on the anterior end, and a locomotory structure within their muscle and so on. They're going to have a closed circulatory system, and their nerve cord is ventral on the belly side. Ours is dorsal. Ours runs along our back, our spinal cord. So when you look here at this earthworm here, this is the anterior end, and here's the nerve cord right there. It's that yellow cord. So it's almost as if this earthworm sat up, the anterior end, just like you see here, is sitting upward, and then is leaning back like this, and there's where the nerve cord is. So this is the ventral side. This would be the dorsal side. They have a ventral nerve cord, but they're going to have a dorsal and a ventral blood vessel. And they're going to have these ring-like structures that connect the two vessels, and they sometimes refer to them as hearts, but they don't really provide a lot of force for moving around the blood within those blood vessels. And there's other mechanisms for doing that. So here I have a video of an earthworm actually moving, and so that's something you're supposed to do in lab, is study their motion. And you can see they alternate between stretching out and then shortening up, and that's accomplished with the help of two sets of muscles: longitudinal muscles that move along, and then circular muscles that move around. The circular muscles actually pinch off areas of the body, and so that allows them to move their fluid around within. And they don't have bones or muscles pulling on bones or any kind of skeletal plate-like structures. Instead, those muscles are pushing on the fluid within the body cavity. And that's referred to as a hydrostatic skeleton, which was mentioned in the earlier chapter when it came to the Cnidarians, right? So they do have specialized parts of the digestive system. When you look in there, the earthworm, for example, has a crop for storage, a gizzard for grinding down the food, and then intestine for absorbing the nutrients. So for locomotion, their coelomic fluid I mentioned is a hydrostatic, serves as a hydrostatic skeleton, and they alternate contractions between those circular and longitudinal muscles, and that gets that movement overall. They're going to have these bristle-like or hair-like structures made of chitin that extend from the body. In some, they're very obvious. In the earthworms, you have to actually touch them to feel them, but they're called chetae, or cheta, singular. Closed circulatory system, and they do gas exchange by diffusion across their body surfaces. They don't have like a respiratory tract where they take air in. They do have excretory system, like most animals. Their excretory system is nephridia, similar to mollusks, complete with the nephrostomes, the little openings. They're going to take those fluids in and then get rid of the waste products and try to reabsorb things they need. So for the annelids, which is a phylum, the phylum is Annelida. Annelid is less formal. So for these classes, they have two. And even these are somewhat not being used anymore because of new advances in the understanding of the phylogeny of this group. And more traditionally than this class was broken into two classes here. And so this class, Oligochaeta, which means few bristles. The chetae, remember, are the bristle-like, hair-like structures. Oligos means few. These were the earthworms. And the polychaete means many bristles, right? And the bristles are a lot longer. And then the Hyrodinia don't really have very much chetae to begin with, but these are the leeches. So these were considered, and for the laboratory, we're going to call them that, class Oligochaeta and class Hyrodinia, and then the class Polychaeta. So when we look at the Polychaeta, the monophyly of this groups are not well established. That was mentioned earlier. Looking at the polychaetes, the class we're going to refer to as class Polychaeta. This is the head end here. They do have a mouth. They do have some eyes. This is a clamworm that was seen earlier in the picture. And you can see they have these bristles that stick out of the side. You can see the segments there. And then these little fleshy like lobes that stick out at every segment. And those are called parapodia. And so the parapodia do have blood vessels that enter there, so they can be used for gas exchange across the surface of those parapodia. And then they have these bristles here, and so these parapodia can assist in locomotion as well, moving around. And they are gonochoric, external fertilization. They have that trochophore larva. Remember, they're in the Lophotrochozoa group. These include worms called clamworms, and that's a clamworm right there in the genus Nereis. Scale worms, lungworms, sea mice are cool. They don't look like mice, but maybe somewhat superficially. And then tube worms. And so there's a picture of tube worms there. It's much larger in your book than it is here, but they do live within these tube-like structures that they produce there. The adults are gutless, which means they don't have a gut, and basically they're filter feeding there. And so they live in these deep sea areas where there's cracks in the ocean crust, the rock at the floor of the ocean, and hot water comes up from there that's exposed deeper down to the hot rock, deeper down in the earth. And that brings up a lot of minerals, and bacteria use this to produce biomass, so they grow based on that. And so these tube worms can feed off of these bacteria as an energy source. So they live near these hydrothermal vents. This is the genus Riftia. I suppose that's relevant to rifts or breaks in the crust that you have in these areas there. And then the class Clitellata or Clitella I've seen it written both ways. This is a group that collects both the earthworms and the leeches. The new taxonomy suggests that we had a common ancestry to the Polychaeta right here, and then from that group arose the earthworms, and then they share common ancestry with the leeches. So here's your Oligochaeta, and then the Hyrodinia right there. And so these are grouped within the polychaetes. So things have gotten a little bit flipped. The world of understanding these worms has gotten turned upside down based on new information. But for now, we're going to go with the older classification system. An earthworm is still going to look like an earthworm. And they get their name because as you move back about not more than 20 segments back, they're going to have some fused segments. And then further segments after that. That structure there is called the clitellum. And so this group basically has that, and that includes the earthworms and the leeches. The leeches only get them, most species will get them during the breeding season, and then they lose it. It's associated with reproduction overall. They don't have parapodia like the polychaete annelids that we saw there, like the clamworm. The head's not well differentiated, and they don't have eyes, but they do have a brain up towards the front, or two ganglia there that then connect to the ventral nerve cord. They have a few, which is where the name for the earthworms, remember it's the class, we're going to refer to them as the class Oligochaeta. What happened there? The class Oligochaeta. And that means few, relatively few. They are hermaphroditic, so these earthworms are carrying both ovaries and testes, but they cross-fertilize. And what they do is they transfer sperm from one individual to another, so they exchange sperm. And then they store that sperm. And then when the eggs are going to become fertilized, the eggs are released, and the clitellum produces this mucousy material that it then, through that movements we saw, moves that mucus forward, or that material forward, and then it picks up the eggs, and then picks up the sperm that it got from the other one. The sperm fertilizes the eggs, and then the structure comes off the end there and forms a cocoon. So this mucousy cocoon now is going to protect and house those fertilized eggs as they develop into larvae and then into earthworms. So that's the function of the clitellum for the Clitellata or the Clitella group. Again, we're going to go with this old scheme for your laboratory, the class Oligochaeta. It's on that list of names to know. So follow the list that I provide for you for the names, the taxonomy there. Here's two earthworms exchanging sperm during mating. Overall, the immature earthworms won't have the clitellum. I know because we had some dissections in the lab and we couldn't find the clitellum, and I did a little research because I'm not an invertebrate zoologist. And what I read up on is that the clitellum doesn't develop until they become sexually mature. So pretty interesting. Now for the leeches, we're going to refer to, I'm not sure why those lines appeared. The leeches, we're going to refer to these as, for now, the class Hyrodinia. And the book gives a discussion as to this old classification scheme and then what the systematists think now as they've uncovered new evidence. So the leeches occur mostly in fresh water. They're going to be flattened dorsoventrally, so their body's overall flat. And so you can see a picture of a leech here. So this would be the dorsum of the back and then the belly side on the other side. You can see they're going to have a sucker on the front and one on the back. And they move way different than earthworms. They move more like an inchworm. And many of them are ectoparasites. You can see this is a medical leech. They sometimes use these leeches to help relieve too much buildup of fluid. So they have these special teeth-like structures. They're not teeth like our teeth, but these structures that help cut into the flesh of the animal. And then they produce a protein. So this is part of one of the objectives that was the beginning. And this protein prevents the blood from clotting. It's an anticoagulant, is what they call them. And the name of that protein is named after this class. The class is Hyrodinia, and the protein is Hyrudinin, I think. I got to go back. It's something similar to the name there, is what I remember there. So that's how these ectoparasites work. Now, not all leeches are ectoparasites and live off the blood of animals. Some are detritivores, and that means they move around the forest floors or within the pond that they swim around in, and they just pick up dead organic material. Overall, so that's what's meant by flattened dorsoventrally. They are hermaphroditic, just like the earthworms. They do have a clitellum, except for, I think, one species doesn't do it, but it only comes out during breeding season. Like, you don't see the clitellum here. But when this medical leech goes through that, I think the scientific name is based on the medicine, like Hyrodia. Hyrodia is the genus, and then Medicina or something like that for the entire scientific name. The coelom is reduced, and we don't have divided segments inside, so there's no septa in there. So this is a modification from ancestors of the earthworms. So the leeches evolved from common ancestor with the earthworm group in the newer understanding. Again, they have suckers on both ends. They're not going to have any cheta, so they lost those bristle-like structures. Some are detritivores, others are going to suck blood. So in this section, we're going to look at two different phyla, the phylum Bryozoa, which literally translates to moss animals, and then the Brachiopods. The formal taxon is the phylum Brachiopoda. And so here your outcomes are to describe the lophophore and its function. These are going to have lophophores in the mature animal. And we're going to distinguish between Bryozoans and Brachiopods, the two phyla that are grouped together here. They are mostly marine animals. Both are characterized by having that lophophore. That lophophore, remember, is that U-shaped structure around the mouth, or circular. It's going to have those tentacles with cilia. And there may be 1 to 2 rows of that. And the function there is to help bring food particles in and for gas exchange. So for feeding and gas exchange. And this may be a case of convergent evolution. So the phylogeny with these groups is not certain on there. So convergent evolution is when two different groups from two different branches of the evolutionary tree, two different ancestries, end up coming to having the same types of structures based on the environment they live in. Those pressures shaped and molded these individuals. So groups. So here they are. They're within that same clade that we've been looking at with the annelids and the mollusks and the Nemertea. Looks like we've gone through all of these already. And so looking at the Bryozoans, they're called the moss animals, just like the Bryophyta would be the mosses, right? So they're smaller, they live in colonies. Their anus opens near the mouth, so you can see that they're pointing to the anus here. And then the mouth is actually inside this area here where the lophophore is. And you can see a real picture here of a colony of them. They do secrete this chitinous chamber. So chitin is that material found in the cell walls of fungi. You also find it in the exoskeleton of things like insects. And this chitinous chamber is called the zoecium, where they live in. So here's the zoecium here, and you can see the zoecium here, a colony of them there. And they actually have a muscle that allows them to withdraw themselves into the zoecium, I suppose if there's danger around. But they use that lophophore, that U-shaped, horseshoe-shaped tentacles of cilia to help get oxygen and get rid of CO2 and to help bring food in. Some may deposit calcium carbonate and help form reefs like the coral animals do. Asexual reproduction can occur frequently by budding. Then we have the Brachiopoda. These are sometimes called lamp shells or brachiopods. They kind of look like clams, but there's a difference here. The clam has left and right shells, whereas a brachiopod has a dorsal and ventral shell. So they have a top and bottom shell instead. And within the shells here, you can see the lophophores there within this area here. And the lophophores sit on top of part of the body. So here's part of the body there. You can see the gonads here, which are the sex organs. You can see some muscles that help close the lamp here, and the pedicel, which literally translates to the foot, where they attach there. And they filter feed as well. And so these are the brachiopods. And then there's another closely related group. In this group here, I think there's maybe 15 species identified. They're called phoronids, and they used to be placed in a separate phylum, and so now they're placed with these other groups here. So the phoronids, they kind of look like the Bryozoans there. And these are going to secrete individual chitinous tubes rather than colony there, and they can extend their lophophores out there. So these are called phoronids. So this group here, we're going to look at a phylum called Nematoda, and they're commonly called roundworms. They don't have segmentation. So your learning outcomes for the Nematoda are to describe the musculature of nematodes that allows it to wriggle in a highly characteristic manner. You can see they seem to just wave back and forth. These are tiny roundworms called vinegar eels. And they're only able to move back and forth because they don't have circular muscle like an earthworm does. They just have longitudinal muscles. All they're able to do is just wiggle side to side overall. Your second objective there is to explain the life cycle of a nematode and how it produces disease in humans. So there are many free-living nematodes, probably more than parasites, but we know a lot about those that do parasitize humans and other animals, and these parasites often are pathogenic and cause disease. So here we are. We're looking at our first group of ecdysozoan protostomes. So we're still with the protostomes. Deuterostomes is the next chapter over here. And here's your nematodes, and they're ecdysozoans, so they do shed. They're going to shed their cuticle the way ecdysozoans, characteristic ecdysozoans. So what are nematode characteristics? Well, they include things like those vinegar eels we saw, eelworms, and other roundworms. Members of this phylum are found everywhere. They're found in soil. They help break down the material within the soil to help recycle nutrients. And again, some are parasites. And some parasites don't necessarily cause disease, but some are parasites and cause disease. Many are free-living. Some live in marine habitats, that's salt water. Some live in freshwater ponds and lakes. Other characteristics, they are bilaterally symmetrical, but they are not segmented, so unsegmented. They're going to be covered with a flexible, thick cuticle, but it must be molted for them to grow. The other protostomes we've been looking at, this is the first group of ecdysozoans. The other ones, they just continue to grow here. Ecdysozoa has to shed that, get rid of that cuticle before their body can grow any bigger. Their digestive system is relatively well developed. They're going to have these structures called stylets, which are piercing organs near the mouth. And this would be true especially if they're parasitic. They're going to have a pharynx, which creates a sucking action, and then an anus at the other end. They're not going to have as highly developed a digestive system as an earthworm would. And so here's your basic body plan. And this one is a male. The males tend to be smaller, and they're going to have this hooked posterior end out here. Here's the mouth area. And then they put a section through there. And nematodes are pseudo-coelomates. So they have a pseudocoelom. So you can see here you only have an endoderm on the inside in their body cavity, then it's not completely enclosed by mesodermally derived tissue overall. And this one is a male. You can see it has testes here. The female, they tend to be larger, and that's sort of characteristic because you have more space to produce more eggs. Sperm cells are relatively small. So here is your basic setup there, and they're only going to have longitudinal muscles within the body wall there. So for reproduction, most are going to be gonochoric, means separate male and female. There's going to be sexual dimorphism. Dimorphic means two different kinds. It means male smaller with a hook end. Females are going to be larger and thicker. Fertilization is internal. So the male has to transfer the sperm to the female. And this indirect development, you start off with egg, there's a larval stage that's indirect. So there's a metamorphosis that occurs, and then you go to adult. Then for lifestyles, some are active hunters. I was looking for a video when I was looking for those little vinegar eels, and I saw a larger nematode capture a smaller nematode and was trying to eat it. So some are predatory. Some prey on protists and other small animals, like the video I saw. Others are parasites of plants, and some others are going to live within the bodies of larger animals. There is a 9-meter long nematode. Remember, a meter is about a yard. It's a little bigger than a yard, so we're talking about easily 20 feet here. And this one parasitizes the placenta of sperm whales. Some nematodes do cause disease in humans. About 50 species do. There's one called Necator, and this one is not just parasite of humans. This can affect your dog and so on. They belong to a genus called Necator. And what they do is they attach the inner wall of your intestines, and they're basically break into the blood vessels and are taking fluids from you in blood. That can cause anemia and then real severe infestations, not infection. When you're infested with a parasite, can lead to death, especially if the individual is very weak. There's another one called Trichinella. This is genus, causes trichinosis. And this one, the larva forms cysts in muscles. There's an image that'll show that to you here. And so let's say you eat, say, a pig or pork, or even some other kinds of animals that have this parasite encysted in their muscle. When you eat it and you don't cook it right, you don't kill the larvae that are cysted within the meat that you're eating, and then you become infected, and then those larvae go to different kinds of muscle, like your tongue and even your heart muscle, and can cause disease and, in worst case scenario, death. So here's this is muscle tissue, and you can see the larval cysts there just waiting to be consumed by the next host. And then the pinworm. I remember this one when I was a kid. The scientific name is Enterobius vermicularis there. Affects about 11% of the population, and here, if you get the eggs in, and remember, parasites like these produce lots of eggs because getting into a host is rare for them. So many of them never end up getting in host, but for these, the eggs can be found everywhere. And so you tell your kids, wash your hands. Well, one of the reasons is that they're playing around in the dirt, they can pick these up. The females live in the rectum, which is the last part of your large intestine before you get to the anus, and the females come out especially at night. I don't know how they know if it's dark time or whatever, but they come out at night and cause severe itching. And you can tell when a child has one because of the way they are really bothered by that itching. It's in the perianal area, the area around the anus, where the females are coming out to lay their eggs. And then there's Ascaris lumbricoides. This is the intestinal roundworm. It's found in pigs. This is the scientific name. You should know the genus for laboratory. Ascaris is a representative of the roundworms. as one of them. I also want you to know Enterobius. But coming back here, these can get pretty big. The females can get to 30 centimeters long. The males are smaller. And it's thought that 1 in 6, estimated 1 in 6 worldwide, are infected by this. Again, the eggs are found everywhere. The female produces lots and lots of eggs. You can get them just by an egg being blown with the dust and landing on your mouth, and you take them in. It's going to be rare, though, where we have modern plumbing, good sanitation overall. And then there's tropical disease, nematode disease called filariasis. And this group here is also related to the heartworms you get in the dogs and cats can get and so on. But there's one filarial worm, it's a roundworm, that when it does get transmitted to you, usually by a biting insect that's carrying the larva, they bite you and it gets transferred into your body, and the larvae migrate to your lymphatic vessels. Your lymphatic vessels are another kind of vessel. You have your blood vessels, arteries and veins, but there's another vessels that help return body tissue fluid back to your cardiovasculars, to your veins. Because when the blood gets to your tissues in your body, your fluid leaks out at the smallest blood vessels, and so that fluid leaks into the tissues because part of the interstitial tissue, 85% of it is brought back in to your blood vessels. That means 15% gets left behind, and it's your lymphatic vessels that helps return that fluid back. But the problem here is that these worms lodge in those blood vessels and block the return of that fluid and causes a condition or disease called elephantiasis. And the body parts where the blockage occurs get really swelled, abnormally so, and it's not pleasant to see. But it can be very, very serious.